Story 1. The Midnight Visitor. It was close to midnight, and Adam's shift at the gas station was coming to an end. The fluorescent lights above buzzed quietly, casting a sickly glow over the empty parking lot. As usual, the place was dead, with only the occasional truck passing through the rural highway. Adam preferred it this way. Less noise, fewer problems. But tonight felt off. The wind howled outside, carrying with it the crisp autumn air. Adam leaned back in his chair, scrolling mindlessly through his phone when the station's automatic door opened with a loud chime. He sat up immediately, expecting a late-night traveler, but there was no one at the entrance. The door slowly slid closed, and the silence returned. Adam felt a chill crawl up his spine. Probably just the wind, he muttered to himself. Just as he was about to relax, the door opened again. This time, he saw a man step inside. He was tall, his face obscured by a dark hoodie. His movements were sluggish, almost mechanical. Adam squinted, trying to get a better look at him, but something about the man made him instinctively uncomfortable. "Evening," Adam greeted, trying to sound casual. The man didn't respond. Instead, he wandered slowly down the aisles, his back turned to Adam. The security cameras captured every movement, but the man's face remained hidden under the hood. Minutes passed, and the man still hadn't picked up anything. Adam couldn't shake the feeling of dread. He watched the man move awkwardly, as though he didn't quite know what he was looking for. Then, without warning, the man stopped at the end of the aisle and slowly turned to face the security camera. Adam's breath caught in his throat. The camera footage flickered for a moment, but when it stabilized, the man's face was still hidden. He should say something. "Sir, do you need any help?" Adam asked, his voice tinged with nervousness. The man didn't reply. Instead, he tilted his head slowly, as if considering the question. Then, in a whisper barely audible over the hum of the lights, he said, "You shouldn't be here." Adam blinked, trying to process the words. "What do you mean?" he asked, his heart pounding in his chest. The man stepped closer, his face still obscured. "They'll come for you, just like they came for me." Before Adam could react, the lights in the gas station flickered, and the temperature dropped suddenly. A loud crash came from outside, like metal being torn apart. Adam rushed to the window and peered outside. The parking lot was empty, but something in the distance moved, shadowy figures crawling toward the station from the woods, their forms barely visible in the dim light. Panicked, Adam turned back to the man, but he was gone. The store was empty, save for the eerie glow of the lights and the sound of the wind outside. Adam grabbed his phone to call for help, but there was no signal. The shadowy figures were closer now, their shapes becoming more distinct. Then the gas station's lights went out completely. Story 2. The Vanishing Pump. Melissa was on her way home from a road trip, exhausted and eager to get back to her apartment. The highway was dark, and the only sign of civilization for miles was an old run-down gas station. She pulled into the station, noticing that it looked abandoned. The pumps were covered in dust and the windows of the store were grimy. Still, her car was running low on fuel, and she had no choice but to stop. She parked next to the nearest pump and stepped out of her car. The cold night air bit at her skin, and a sense of unease washed over her. Something about the gas station felt wrong, but she brushed it off as paranoia from being tired. Melissa fumbled with her wallet, then lifted the nozzle to fill up her tank. As she stood there, waiting for the tank to fill, she glanced at the reflection in the window of her car. For a split second, she saw something move behind her. Startled, she whipped around, but there was nothing there, just the empty lot and the faint rustling of the trees in the distance. She shook her head, trying to calm herself. "Get it together, Melissa," she muttered. But as she turned back to face the pump, she realized something chilling. The pump was gone. The nozzle she had been holding was still in her hand, but the entire gas pump had vanished without a trace. Melissa's mind raced. How was that possible? She stepped back, scanning the lot. The other pumps were still there, rusted and old, but the one she had been using had completely disappeared. A growing sense of dread consumed her. Desperate, She got back into her car and tried to start the engine. It sputtered but wouldn't turn over. Her heart pounded in her chest as she frantically looked around. There was no one in sight, and the station felt like it had been abandoned for decades. That's when she noticed the figure standing by the tree line. It was a man, barely visible in the dark, his body still as a statue. He was watching her. Melissa's instincts screamed at her to get away. She fumbled with her phone, trying to call for help, but there was no signal. When she looked up again, the man was closer, his face obscured by the shadows. He wasn't walking, he was just there, closer each time she blinked. In a panic, she jumped out of the car and ran toward the gas station's convenience store. The door creaked as she pushed it open, revealing a dusty, decrepit interior. Shelves were toppled over and cobwebs hung from the ceiling. The place had been abandoned for years. She turned to close the door behind her, but froze. The man was standing in the doorway, staring at her with eyes that gleamed in the darkness. Melissa screamed. Story 3. The Stranger at Pump 4. Jake was working the night shift at the highway gas station. It wasn't his favorite job, but it paid the bills, and the quiet nights usually meant he could catch up on reading or watch movies on his phone. He'd been on the job long enough to get used to the occasional weird customer, but this night was different. It was around 2 a.m. when a car pulled up to Pump 4, its headlights cutting through the darkness. The car was an old sedan, rusted and worn down, the kind that hadn't been manufactured in decades. Jake watched as a man stepped out, dressed in a black suit that looked far too expensive for a car like that. The man walked slowly to the pump, his movements deliberate. His face was pale, his eyes hollow. Jake felt a strange unease as he watched the man from behind the counter. The man at Pump 4 didn't pick up the nozzle. He just stood there, staring at the pump, as if waiting for something. Jake tapped the screen of his register, hoping the man would come inside or drive off, but he didn't. Minutes passed, and the man didn't move. Finally, Jake grabbed his jacket and stepped outside, the cool night air biting at his skin. "Hey man, you need help?" he called out. The man didn't respond. He just kept staring at the pump. Jake approached cautiously, his gut telling him something was very wrong. When he got close enough to see the man's face, his blood ran cold. The man's eyes were completely black, void of any life or reflection. His skin looked waxy, almost like a mannequin. Before Jake could react, the man slowly turned to face him. His mouth opened, and in a voice that didn't sound human, he whispered, "You don't belong here." Jake stumbled back, his heart racing. Without another word, the man got back into his car, started the engine, and drove off into the night. Jake watched as the taillights disappeared down the highway, but something caught his eye. Pump 4 was covered in blood, dripping down the sides of the metal. There was no sign of the man or his car, but the blood remained. Jake didn't stay to find out what it meant. He grabbed his keys, locked the station, and quit his job the next day. Story 1. The Phantom Roommate. It was the first week of college for Jenna, a freshman at a prestigious university far from home. Her dorm room was cozy but small, with barely enough space for 2 people to move around. But what bothered her more was the eerie feeling that lingered in the room at night. Her roommate Sarah was friendly enough, though they weren't close yet. They'd agreed to keep things quiet after 10 p.m. so both could sleep and focus on their studies. One night around 2 a.m., Jenna woke up to the sound of soft whispers. She assumed it was Sarah on the phone with someone. Half asleep, she rolled over, hoping to fall back into her dreams. But the whispers grew louder and more insistent. Confused and slightly irritated, she sat up and turned toward Sarah's bed, ready to ask her to be quiet. But Sarah wasn't there. Her bed was empty and the room was dark, save for the faint glow of Jenna's bedside lamp. The whispers continued. Jenna's heart began to race as she realized the voices were coming from within the room, but not from anywhere she could see. They seemed to float in the air, surrounding her, filling the space with unintelligible murmurs. Terrified, Jenna bolted out of bed and ran to the bathroom down the hall, where she stayed for the rest of the night. The next morning, Sarah returned, having spent the night at her boyfriend's apartment. When Jenna told her what had happened, Sarah went pale. "That's exactly what the last girl who lived here said," Sarah whispered. She moved out after the first month. She claimed the room was haunted. Jenna brushed it off as a prank at first, but the whispers didn't stop. They became more frequent, always at night, always when she was alone. She tried everything, music, earplugs, even sleeping pills, but nothing could drown out the eerie murmurs. Eventually, Jenna moved out, just like the girl before her. To this day, she still wonders who or what was trying to communicate with her in the dead of night. Story 2. The Shadow in the Library. Tom was a senior at a small liberal arts college in New England. With finals approaching, he spent most of his time in the campus library, a beautiful yet ominous Gothic building that was rumored to be haunted. Tom didn't believe in ghosts. The stories about students seeing strange things after midnight were, in his opinion, just legends passed down to scare freshmen. Late one evening, well after midnight, Tom was studying in one of the library's older, less used sections. The area was nearly deserted, with only a few other students scattered at tables across the floor. As he sat hunched over his notes, he felt the temperature drop around him. The chill was sudden and sharp, almost unnatural. He glanced around, but none of the nearby windows were open. Shrugging it off, Tom returned to his work, but moments later, he saw something out of the corner of his eye, a figure standing near the far bookshelf. He looked up, expecting to see another student, but there was no one there. Only rows of books and dimly lit aisles. Tom's heart raced, but he forced himself to stay calm. "It's just your imagination," he muttered under his breath, but deep down, he knew something wasn't right. He tried to concentrate, but every few minutes, the same shadowy figure seemed to appear in his peripheral vision. No matter how fast he turned to look, it always vanished. Finally, he decided he'd had enough. He packed up his things and made his way toward the library exit. As he passed through the aisle where he'd first seen the figure, Tom felt a cold breeze brush past him. He froze, unable to move as a whispering voice echoed through the empty library. "You shouldn't be here." Terrified, Tom ran. He didn't stop until he was outside, gasping for breath. He never studied in that section of the library again, and he learned later that several students had experienced similar encounters with the shadowy figure. Some said it was the ghost of a student who had died there decades ago, unable to leave the library even in death. Whether that was true or not, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him that night. Story 3. The Dormitory Nightmare. Lisa was a sophomore living in a dormitory known for its cheap rent and rundown appearance. It wasn't the nicest building on campus, but it was what she could afford. Despite its age, she liked her room on the third floor, except for one odd thing: the locked door at the end of the hallway. No one seemed to know where it led, and every time Lisa asked, she got vague answers. Some said it was just an old storage closet. Others claimed it had been sealed off because of asbestos. One night, Lisa was coming back from a late shift at her part-time job. The hallway was unusually quiet, and as she passed the locked door, she heard a faint knocking from the other side. Curious but unnerved, she paused, leaning closer to listen. The knocking stopped. She stood there for a moment, debating whether to go back to her room or try to figure out what was behind the door. Her curiosity got the better of her. She pressed her ear against the door. A soft voice, barely audible, whispered, "Help me!" Lisa jumped back, her heart pounding. She ran down the hall and locked herself in her room, hoping she had imagined the whole thing. For the next few days, she tried to avoid the hallway altogether, but every time she passed the door, she heard the same faint knocking and the same whispered plea for help. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore. One evening, she asked the dorm's resident advisor, RA, about the door. The RA's face darkened. "You're not supposed to go near that door," he said quietly. "It's been locked for a reason." When Lisa pressed him for more information, he hesitated before telling her the story. Decades ago, a student had gone missing in that very dormitory. The last place she was seen was in the hallway near Lisa's room. After months of searching, authorities gave up, and the room she had lived in was sealed off. Some people claimed they still heard her knocking, trying to get out, Lisa was horrified, but she tried to rationalize the story. Maybe it was just an old legend meant to scare new students. Still, the knocking continued, and the voice grew more desperate. One night, Lisa decided to confront it. Armed with nothing but a flashlight, she approached the door and called out, "Who's there?" The knocking stopped for a moment, then started again, louder this time. The voice was more insistent. "Help me!" Terrified, Lisa ran back to her room and called campus security. They arrived quickly, but when they opened the locked door, there was nothing inside, just an empty, dusty room that hadn't been touched in years. The knocking stopped after that night, but Lisa never forgot the voice. She moved out of the dorm at the end of the semester, and the door remained locked, as if the university had decided some mysteries were better left unsolved. Story 1. The Crying Woman in the Woods. It was late October, just a week before Halloween, when a group of college friends, Sarah, Mike, Lena, and Dave, decided to go camping in the Appalachian foothills. The trees were ablaze with the colors of fall, their golden and crimson leaves blanketing the forest floor. It was the perfect setting for a spooky weekend getaway. The first night went smoothly, crackling campfires, toasted marshmallows, and light-hearted ghost stories. But as the night wore on and the wind picked up, strange things began to happen. Lena was the first to notice it. A faint, almost inaudible sound echoing through the woods. It sounded like crying, a woman's cry. The others dismissed it as the wind, but Lena couldn't shake the eerie feeling. The next day, the group hiked deeper into the woods. As they ventured further, they found an old, abandoned cabin, long since overtaken by nature. Vines crawled up its sides, and the windows were dark, shattered from age. A sign by the door read, "Latham House," and though none of them recognized the name, the cabin felt inexplicably familiar. That evening, as darkness fell, the crying returned. This time it was unmistakable, a woman's voice weeping in the distance coming from the direction of the cabin. Dave, ever the skeptic, decided to investigate, taking Sarah with him. Armed with flashlights and a sense of adventure, they followed the sound through the trees. The crying grew louder as they approached the cabin, a heart-wrenching sob that seemed to surround them. But when they reached the front door, the sound stopped. The silence was suffocating. Dave pushed the door open, and they stepped inside. Dust coated the floor, and cobwebs draped the corners of the room. It was clear no one had been there for years. Suddenly, Sarah's flashlight flickered, and the beam landed on something in the corner, a figure, pale and ghostly, hunched over in the shadows. It was a woman, her back turned to them, her long, tangled hair hanging over her shoulders. "Ma'am?" Dave called out, his voice shaking. The woman didn't move. Sarah took a step closer, but before she could say anything, the figure let out a blood-curdling scream. The woman turned, her face contorted in agony, eyes hollow and dark. Sarah dropped the flashlight and bolted for the door, dragging Dave with her. They ran back to the campsite, breathless and terrified. When they told the others what they'd seen, no one believed them at first, until the crying returned, this time closer than before. The sound echoed through the trees, louder and more desperate. It wasn't just the wind, and it wasn't their imaginations. The next morning they packed up and left, abandoning the trip early. They later learned the story of Latham House, how a woman named Mary Latham had lived there with her husband in the late 1800s. She had gone mad after her husband's death, wandering the woods at night, weeping for him. One day, she vanished, never to be seen again. To this day, hikers still report hearing her cries, echoing through the forest, especially in the fall when the wind carries her sorrow through the trees. Story 2. The Haunting of Autumn Ridge Cemetery. In the small town of Autumn Ridge, nestled in the Midwest, there's a cemetery that the locals avoid once the leaves start to fall. Autumn Ridge Cemetery looks serene during the day, with rows of old tombstones and towering oak trees. But as soon as dusk settles, strange things begin to happen. It was a chilly October evening when Liz and her friends, Evan and Melissa, decided to take a walk through the cemetery. It was something they did every year for fun, daring each other to get as close as possible to the infamous dollhouse grave. The grave belonged to a young girl named Emily Foster, who had died in the 1920s. Her parents, grief-stricken, had built a small dollhouse over her grave, filling it with her favorite toys. The dollhouse was infamous in town because of the many strange occurrences surrounding it. People claimed to hear the sound of toys being played with late at night, or to see the flicker of candlelight inside the tiny windows. Liz, Evan, and Melissa thought it was all just a story to scare kids, but tonight they were about to find out the truth. As they reached the dollhouse grave, they noticed something strange. The small door to the dollhouse was open. Normally, it was locked. Liz, ever curious, stepped forward to close it, but as her hand touched the tiny knob, she felt an icy chill run through her body. She froze, and that's when the sound started. Soft at first, like a distant whisper, but unmistakable. Laughter. A child's laughter, echoing through the cemetery. Evan and Melissa backed away, but Liz was rooted to the spot. The laughter grew louder, and then, without warning, the dollhouse door slammed shut. Liz screamed and stumbled back, her heart racing. The three of them turned and ran, not stopping until they were safely out of the cemetery gates. They told their friends about the experience, but no one believed them. That is, until more people started reporting strange happenings around the dollhouse. Visitors would find the door open, despite locking it the night before. Some claimed to see the silhouette of a little girl in the windows, while others heard soft singing in the breeze. But the most disturbing incident occurred a few weeks later, when a local caretaker, Bill, was doing his nightly rounds. He'd always been skeptical of the ghost stories, dismissing them as local legend. But that night, as he passed by the dollhouse grave, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A small figure standing beside the dollhouse, watching him. It was a little girl, her dress fluttering in the wind, her eyes dark and hollow. Bill ran, and the next day he quit his job, refusing to set foot in the cemetery again. To this day, the dollhouse grave remains one of the most haunted spots in Autumn Ridge, and no one dares visit it after dark. Story 3. The Scarecrow's Revenge. Every fall, the small farming town of Hawthorne held a harvest festival, complete with hay rides, pumpkin patches, and, most famously, a scarecrow competition. The scarecrows were a big deal. Farmers would spend weeks crafting their creations, each one hoping to win the coveted Best Scarecrow award. But in the fall of 1985, something went horribly wrong. Old Man Jenkins, a reclusive farmer who lived on the outskirts of town, had always been a strange character. He kept to himself, rarely coming into town, and his farm was rumored to be cursed. That year, however, Jenkins entered the scarecrow competition for the first time. His creation was unlike anything anyone had ever seen, tall and menacing, with glowing eyes made from old glass bottles and long, bony fingers fashioned from rusted wire. When the festival began, Jenkins' scarecrow quickly became the talk of the town. It was eerie, almost lifelike in its detail, but there was something unsettling about it, something that made people feel uneasy. The townspeople joked that it was haunted, but the joke quickly turned to fear when strange things started happening. The first incident occurred a few days after the festival. A young boy, Jimmy, had been playing near Jenkins' farm when he saw something moving in the cornfields. At first he thought it was a deer, but then he realized it was the scarecrow, walking. Jimmy ran home, terrified, but his parents didn't believe him. The next night, Old Man Jenkins was found dead in his barn, his body contorted in a grotesque position. His face was frozen in a look of sheer terror. The scarecrow was gone from its post. Over the next few weeks, more strange occurrences plagued the town. Farmers reported seeing the scarecrow roaming their fields at night, its glowing eyes visible in the darkness. Livestock went missing, and crops were found trampled, as if by giant unseen hands. One night, a group of teenagers decided to investigate. They snuck onto Jenkins' farm, hoping to catch a glimpse of the infamous scarecrow. What they found was far worse. As they approached the cornfield, they saw the scarecrow standing in the distance, its glass eyes reflecting the moonlight. But then it moved. Slowly at first, then faster, its rusted limbs creaking as it lurched toward them. The teenagers ran, but one of them, Tommy, tripped and fell. The scarecrow was upon him in an instant, its bony fingers wrapping around his neck. His friends pulled him free and dragged him back to town, but Tommy was never the same. He refused to speak of what had happened that night, and his family eventually moved away. The scarecrow was never found, but every fall, the people of Hawthorne still whisper about Old Man Jenkins's creation, and no one dares enter the cornfields after dark.